Angel Andrew had never expected a man like Israel Maxwell to notice her, but when he did, it changed the way she saw herself. Angel Andrew's day began like any other, quiet, precise, measured. She sat at her desk in the Maxwell Holdings office, meticulously reviewing the monthly operations report. The hum of computers and distant phone rings filled the modest, glass-walled office. She had always liked spaces that were functional, clean, and unobtrusive, places that let her think clearly. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. Israel Maxwell walked past her workstation, clipboard in hand. He didn't look at her like most men did. There was no appraisal of appearance, no silent comparison. Instead, his gaze lingered on her work, on the way she organized numbers, caught small inconsistencies, and presented solutions with subtle confidence. You caught the discrepancy on line 37, he said, voice calm, unadorned. Good work. Angel blinked, startled by the simplicity of the praise. No critique, no suggestion to fix this or that. Just recognition. Her lips curved into a small, self-conscious smile. Israel continued walking, but the acknowledgement stayed with her. It was unusual to be noticed in this way, and it left a quiet, warming weight in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. Across town, her personal life painted a different picture. Jude Wells, her boyfriend of 3 years, had made her acutely aware of every inch, curve, and flaw. His concern was always framed as care, but the effect was unmistakable. Angel had learned to shrink herself to avoid criticism. She adjusted her clothes, her posture, her habits, all to meet an invisible standard that Jude measured meticulously. That evening, Jude leaned against her apartment doorway, voice calm but firm. You've gained a little weight, he said as though reporting a fact. I just want you to be aware of it, for yourself. Angel nodded, the familiar knot of tension tightening in her chest. I understand, she whispered, suppressing the irritation rising within her. This exchange, as always, ended with her quietly accommodating him, apologizing for being human, for existing in the way she naturally did. At the office the next morning, Israel's presence was different. He didn't comment on her appearance. He didn't measure her. He acknowledged her work, her attention to detail, her consistency. When he said, "Good work," there was no correction attached, no hidden expectation. Recognition for her effort alone. Angel found herself noticing these small moments more than she realized. The contrast unsettled her. The man in her personal life who measured her worth inch by inch, and the man at work who simply recognized her competence without judgment. By the end of the week, the differences were stark. Jude continued his habitual critiques, framing them as concern. Angel absorbed them automatically, apologizing when none was necessary. Yet Israel's brief nods, his quiet recognition of her work, lingered longer than any of Jude's remarks, planting an unfamiliar seed. Maybe her value didn't have to come at the cost of constant correction. That night, as she lay in bed, Angel reflected on the contrast she couldn't yet name. One man's love demanded adjustment. The other's recognition allowed her to exist without shrinking. She didn't understand it fully yet, but she felt the pull of something different. Something steady, quiet, and honest. And somewhere, quietly, Israel Maxwell had noticed her. Not her adjustments, not her compliance, but her persistence, her precision, her unspoken resilience. Angel Andrew had learned long ago that love often came with a price, usually measured in the form of silence, concessions, or apologies for things she hadn't done. And yet, each time she faced Jude Wells, she found herself surrendering just to keep the peace. That morning, Angel walked into her small kitchen, already tense from the barrage of messages Jude had sent overnight. We need to talk. I can't ignore this anymore. The words hovered like a cloud over her day. She had tried to ignore him, but years of habit made confrontation feel unavoidable. Jude was waiting outside her apartment, leaning casually against the wall, phone in hand. His expression was calm, collected, but Angel knew the weight behind it. He never raised his voice. He never lost control. But he had a way of delivering critique so softly that it sounded like care, and yet it left her questioning herself entirely. You need to listen, he said the moment she stepped outside, eyes fixed on her as if reading her very intentions. I'm not going to repeat myself. I care about you, Angel, but some things can't be ignored. Angel felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the slight tremor in her hands. I didn't do anything wrong, she whispered, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Jude shook his head slowly. You never do. That's exactly the problem. You let yourself slide. You make excuses. You think it's okay to ignore reality. She opened her mouth to respond, to insist that she hadn't done anything to deserve this, but the practiced pattern kicked in. Before she knew it, the words came out anyway. "I'm sorry. I'll do better." Jude's face softened, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "That's all I ask. I just want you to see yourself as I do. You could be so much more." Angel nodded again, biting back a mix of frustration and sadness. She had already lost count of how many times she had apologized for things that weren't her fault. Her weight, her choices, even her moods. Each apology felt like a tiny surrender, a piece of herself quietly stripped away to maintain the fragile peace. By mid-morning, Angel had arrived at Maxwell Holdings, carrying the emotional residue of the confrontation. She pushed the door open to her office, greeted the muted hum of the computers, and noticed Israel Maxwell waiting by the doorway, clipboard in hand as usual. He didn't comment on her appearance. He didn't ask about her mood. He simply looked at the reports she had prepared for a meeting that morning, scanning the numbers and notes with quiet precision. "Angel," he said after a moment, nodding toward a detail she had highlighted. "I see you flagged the vendor discrepancy. Good work." The words were simple. No judgment. No expectation. Just recognition. Angel felt an unfamiliar ease spreading through her chest, the tension from the confrontation with Jude loosening slightly. She realized, in a way that startled her, that she had been carrying the weight of other people's judgments for so long that someone noticing her without critique felt almost revolutionary. The day passed slowly. Angel completed her tasks, met deadlines, and maintained a careful professionalism. Yet, in quiet moments, her mind drifted to the contrast between her two worlds. Jude's love demanded adjustment, scrutiny, and apologies she didn't owe. Israel's attention required only presence, competence, and authenticity. Later that evening, Jude called again. The conversation began calmly but quickly spiraled into the familiar territory, critique veiled as concern. "You need to take better care of yourself," he said, his voice almost gentle. "I'm not judging, Angel. I just want the best for you." Angel's fingers tightened around the phone. She felt the old pattern rising: apologize, explain, concede. But this time, a small voice inside her resisted. She hesitated. She began, then paused. Her mind flashed to Israel's calm acknowledgement earlier that day. The memory was a quiet anchor. She didn't owe him, or anyone, an apology for existing as she was. "I'm not going to apologize for that," she said finally, voice firm but low. There was silence on the other end of the line. Angel's chest felt heavy, but for the first time in years, it wasn't suffocating. She hadn't shrunk. She hadn't given in. Jude exhaled, softly, almost in defeat. "Fine," he said, but the edge of authority in his tone remained. "Just think about it." Angel hung up, and for the first time she allowed herself to breathe fully. She realized how much of her life had been spent negotiating her own worth. She realized how often she had surrendered unnecessarily. And she realized that recognition could come without demand, without judgment, a truth Israel Maxwell had quietly shown her that morning. That night, as she prepared for bed, Angel sat by the window and thought about the day. The apology she had not given felt like a small victory, one she could carry silently. It was not dramatic, it was not loud, but it was hers. Israel's quiet recognition and Jude's constant correction had set a pattern in her mind. One demanded compromise, the other reflected authenticity. And somewhere in that contrast, Angel felt the first stirrings of self-respect, an awareness that she didn't have to apologize for existing. Not to Jude, not to anyone. She didn't know it yet, but that realization was the first step toward reclaiming herself, toward seeing that love could exist without constant correction, and that someone like Israel Maxwell might value her simply as she was. Angel Andrew had mastered invisibility. Not the kind that demanded silence, but the kind that made her careful, measured, and almost invisible to herself. Every glance, every word, every bite she took had been assessed, not just by Jude Wells, her boyfriend, but by the unspoken standards she had internalized over years of correction. That morning, as sunlight filtered into her modest apartment, Angel hesitated before choosing her outfit. She held up a blouse she liked but immediately remembered Jude's tone from last night. "That fits a little too tightly. You should wear something looser." Her shoulders slumped, and she replaced the blouse with a softer, baggier sweater. Even the act of dressing had become a negotiation, a compromise with herself before she even saw him. On the subway ride to work, she hunched slightly, drawing her arms inward, making herself smaller in a car crowded with strangers. Each jostle of movement reminded her, occupy less, take up less, be less. She had learned to move in ways that avoided notice, that reduced criticism, that kept her existence quietly acceptable. By the time she arrived at Maxwell Holdings, Angel's posture was cautious but efficient. She walked through the office, offering polite nods, keeping her presence measured, her voice lower than usual. She didn't want to draw attention, yet Israel Maxwell noticed, as he always did. He wasn't critical. He didn't comment on her weight, her posture, or her appearance. He simply observed her efficiency, the subtle way she caught errors before they became problems, the care she applied to every task. "Angel," Israel said as he passed by her workstation, glancing at the figures she had organized. "You anticipated the vendor's delay accurately. Good work." The words were light, almost offhand, but they carried something that Jude's remarks never had: affirmation without expectation, recognition without judgment. Angel felt a slight lift in her chest, a tiny sense of ease she didn't allow herself often. But at lunchtime the tension returned. Jude's text arrived: "You've been quieter than usual. I hope you're paying attention to your health." Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she felt a small wave of dread. It wasn't anger or fear, just a subtle tightening in her chest. She had learned to anticipate correction even from a distance. When she responded, she wrote carefully, "I'm fine. Thank you for your concern." No defense, no complaint. She didn't want to start a fight, yet she already felt herself shrinking under his gaze, even though he was miles away. Back at work, Angel buried herself in spreadsheets, budgets, and timelines. Israel occasionally stopped by, offering brief acknowledgments, a quiet nod, a simple "good job." These moments were becoming something she noticed, something she clung to silently because for the first time, someone was seeing her without demanding change, without criticism. Angel's friends often commented on her quiet demeanor, her tendency to agree, her habit of softening herself in conversation. But she had learned to mask it. The subtle body shaming from Jude had taught her self-restraint, taught her caution, taught her how to make herself smaller to avoid conflict. It was exhausting, but it had become second nature. That evening she met Jude at their usual cafe. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse or scold. Instead, he leaned slightly forward and said, "I've noticed you've been quieter lately. Maybe you're putting on weight again. You should watch it." Angel felt the familiar pang. She wanted to argue, to say that she had been careful, that she hadn't done anything wrong, but the words didn't come. Instead, she nodded, eyes downcast. "I'll be more careful," she said softly. It was automatic, habitual, a learned surrender. Jude's lips curved slightly. "That's all I ask." Walking home, Angel reflected on her day. The contrast between the two men in her life was sharper than ever. One demanded adjustment and obedience, reminding her constantly that she was insufficient. The other, Israel Maxwell, offered recognition without expectation, subtly reinforcing that competence, presence, and quiet confidence were worthy on their own. For the first time, Angel noticed how much of herself she had hidden. She had shrunk in public, at home, and in her own mind, bending to the shape someone else wanted her to be. And yet, she also realized that the smallest interactions with Israel, the brief nods, the quiet acknowledgments, were starting to remind her of her own value. It was a slow awakening, almost imperceptible, but it was happening. Angel wasn't yet ready to resist Jude outright. She still apologized for things she didn't owe, still carried the weight of correction as if it were her fault. But with each passing day, Israel's calm recognition planted seeds of self-worth, tiny reminders that she could exist fully without being measured against another person's standards. By the time she returned home that night, Angel felt a small, private shift in herself. She hadn't said no to Jude, hadn't confronted him, hadn't fully reclaimed her space, but she had begun to notice the difference between love that demanded shrinkage and attention that allowed her to stand tall. For the first time in years, Angel Andrew felt the faint stirrings of quiet defiance, not loud or dramatic, but internal and growing, a subtle awareness that maybe she didn't have to apologize for existing. Angel Andrew had always found the office a place of refuge, in its own quiet, understated way. Maxwell Holdings was not ostentatious. Glass partitions and muted walls gave the space an air of efficiency, not spectacle. No one here measured her worth by her body, her posture, or her smile. Here, results spoke, and she was meticulous about delivering them. That morning, she entered the office with a careful rhythm. Her bag slung over one shoulder, her blazer adjusted just enough to feel competent without drawing unnecessary attention. She had spent the subway ride observing herself in the reflection of the train windows, checking her stance, her expression, the way her movements might be perceived. It was an unconscious habit, honed over years of Jude Wells' subtle critiques. Israel Maxwell was already in his office, moving through reports and nodding at staff as he passed. When he reached her workstation, he stopped briefly to glance at the financial reconciliation she had submitted earlier. "You flagged the discrepancies accurately," he said quietly. "Good foresight." Angel blinked. That was all. No lecture, no suggestion to fix a minor error, no commentary on her methods or style. Recognition alone. The difference struck her every time. Jude's attention demanded adjustment. Israel's acknowledgement simply existed. It was neutral, but it carried weight nonetheless. Angel immersed herself in her work, reviewing budgets and timelines, cross-checking vendor information. She knew her competence was evident here, even if it remained invisible outside these walls. The office had no judgment about her hair, her weight, or her habits. It only had numbers, deadlines, and responsibilities, and she thrived in that space. Around mid-morning, a small issue arose with a project she managed. A vendor had failed to meet a delivery deadline, and Angel was tasked with resolving it. She drafted a careful email anticipating potential responses, and organized a plan that mitigated financial losses. As she sent the email, Israel approached briefly. "Angel," he said, scanning the screen. "You accounted for the delivery delay in the projection. Good foresight. That could save the department a significant sum." She felt a small, quiet relief. Not prideful, not triumphant, just calm acknowledgement. Israel's attention didn't demand change. It simply noted her skill, her effort, her careful thinking. At lunchtime, Angel went to the break room, where she occasionally met colleagues for casual conversation. Even here, she remained measured, careful not to dominate space or attention. She caught herself adjusting her posture, lowering her voice, choosing words cautiously. The lessons from Jude, how to occupy less, how to shrink, were ingrained. Yet even in these small social interactions, Israel's influence lingered. She remembered the way he had nodded at her earlier, brief but meaningful, a subtle reinforcement that competence, presence, and thoughtfulness mattered more than the constant pressure to conform to someone else's standard. The day continued with minor challenges: a misfiled document, a delayed invoice, a client question she had to answer diplomatically. Each task required focus, precision, and restraint. Angel handled them all efficiently, quietly proving her worth in a space that evaluated outcomes, not appearances. By mid-afternoon, Jude's messages began arriving again. "Are you eating enough? I'm worried you're letting yourself go." The subtle judgment made her chest tighten, even though she had learned to ignore some of it. Angel's mind briefly flickered to his presence, then returned to the neutral, steady rhythm of her work. Israel did not intrude. He observed, noted, and acknowledged without commentary. It was stark contrast, and Angel noticed it more acutely with every passing day. When the workday ended, Angel lingered at her desk, finalizing a report that had been pending since morning. Israel passed by, glancing at her screen. "Your projections are clear and thorough. I appreciate your diligence." The words were simple, yet they felt heavier than Jude's critiques. Not because they demanded obedience, but because they reflected authenticity. Angel realized she was beginning to internalize that her value didn't have to be measured against correction, scrutiny, or shrinking herself to fit someone else's expectations. Walking to the elevator, Angel paused briefly, breathing in the quiet of a day completed without confrontation. The office had remained neutral, impartial, and fair, a stark contrast to the constant evaluations that awaited her at home. Here, in this space, she could exist without compromise. As the doors closed, Angel thought about the subtle, growing difference between the two men in her life. Jude measured her worth inch by inch, shaping her into someone smaller than she was. Israel measured her work, her thoughtfulness, and her consistency, qualities she could grow into without fear. It was not romance, not yet. It was acknowledgement, steady and real, and it carried a power of its own. By the time she left the building, Angel felt a quiet shift. She hadn't confronted Jude, hadn't declared independence, hadn't even fully recognized the change inside herself. But for the first time she felt that her existence, her competence, and her presence mattered in a space that did not demand her shrinking. And that subtle awareness, though small, was the beginning of something she had never allowed herself before: seeing herself without apology. Angel Andrew had become adept at containing the sting of Jude Wells' words. Years of careful listening, measured responses, and habitual apologies had forged a quiet resilience, though she didn't yet recognize it as such. His critiques, framed as concern, had once carved themselves deeply into her self-image. Now they were like water hitting stone, impactful but no longer eroding the core of her self-worth entirely. It began one Monday morning when Jude called unexpectedly. Angel, he said, voice calm, controlled, I noticed you've been quieter lately. Are you letting yourself go again? Angel's chest tightened. She felt the old familiar urge to shrink, to apologize, to convince him she was still good enough. But before the words could escape, she paused. The memory of Israel Maxwell's acknowledgement at work earlier that week surfaced. The simple nod, the quiet affirmation of her competence. It reminded her that not all attention carried judgment. I'm fine, she said firmly, surprising even herself. Her voice was steady, low, but unmistakable. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply stated a truth she had known for herself. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Jude's tone didn't rise, but she sensed a flicker of frustration, perhaps the first time he realized his words no longer held automatic control over her. Fine, he muttered eventually. Just pay attention, okay? Angel hung up, exhaling deeply. She felt the familiar weight of habit, but it was lighter this time. She had spoken without conceding, without bending herself to fit someone else's expectations. And it felt quietly like freedom. Later that day at the office, Angel immersed herself in her tasks, allowing the calm neutrality of Maxwell Holdings to wash over her. Israel Maxwell moved past her desk, clipboard in hand. You flagged the shipment discrepancy accurately, he said briefly, nodding toward her report. That level of foresight matters. It was a simple statement, almost casual, but Angel felt it differently now. She realized that competence and recognition could coexist without judgment. His words didn't cut, didn't measure, didn't require her to shrink. They simply acknowledged her presence and skill. Throughout the morning, small instances continued to reinforce the contrast. A colleague misfiled a document, and Angel quietly corrected it without fanfare. Israel noticed, giving a subtle nod as he passed. Angel felt a small, private satisfaction. In that space, her work mattered without requiring her to negotiate her worth. By mid-afternoon, Jude's texts began arriving again. You're probably slacking again. Don't let yourself go. Angel's fingers hovered over the phone, the familiar tension rising. But she didn't respond immediately. She remembered the sense of affirmation from Israel earlier that day, and the memory acted like a shield. After a few moments, she typed simply, I'm focusing on my work. I'll manage. No apology. No self-deprecation. No concessions. Just a statement of fact. The response from Jude was brief and unsatisfying. All right. There was no argument, no insistence. For the first time, Angel realized that not all of her interactions required submission. Not all words demanded compliance. She could exist, assertively and quietly, without being measured against someone else's standard. That evening, Angel returned to her apartment and sat by the window, letting the city's hum wash over her. She reflected on the subtle shift in herself. Jude's words no longer had the same power. They could sting, yes, but they no longer dictated her responses. Israel's quiet attention had begun to reshape her perception of what recognition could feel like, unpressured, affirming, and steady. She remembered a small moment from earlier that week. Israel had stopped by her workstation briefly, glanced at her screen and said, You anticipated this correctly. Good judgment. Simple, offhand, yet profoundly grounding. That single acknowledgement had stayed with her all day, outweighing the dozen critical comments from Jude that would once have reduced her to self-doubt. Angel's mind drifted to her reflection in the office window. For the first time, she saw someone who was quietly standing her ground, not through confrontation or dramatic rebellion, but through subtle assertion. She realized that resistance didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it was measured, deliberate, and internal. The day closed with Angel feeling a small but tangible sense of agency. She hadn't changed Jude. She hadn't ended the patterns that had constrained her for years. But she had begun to draw lines she didn't previously recognize. She didn't have to shrink every time someone commented. She didn't have to apologize for existing. And slowly, subtly, Israel Maxwell's quiet recognition was helping her see that she could reclaim parts of herself that had been eroded over time. By the time she lay in bed, Angel understood a simple truth. Words only cut if she allowed them to. Jude's comments still hovered, still stung, but they no longer defined her reality. And Israel Maxwell had shown her, without drama, without insistence, that affirmation could exist on its own terms, steady and real. For the first time in years, Angel felt the faintest stirrings of clarity. She could exist without constant correction, without habitual apology, and perhaps, eventually, without fear. Angel Andrew had begun to notice a pattern in her life that made her wince whenever she caught herself in it. She begged. Not for survival or for urgent needs, but for approval, for peace, for acceptance, even when she had done nothing wrong. Over years of navigating Jude Wells' quiet corrections and measured criticisms, this behavior had become a reflex, ingrained and automatic. That evening, Angel arrived at their apartment earlier than usual, hoping to preempt another lecture from Jude. She found him in the kitchen, casually stirring tea as if nothing had happened. Yet, she knew the scrutiny was already in the air, in the slight furrow of his brow, the tilt of his head. "Angel," he began softly, "I noticed the way you've been eating lately. I'm concerned. You should really be more careful." She felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Her throat constricted, and her hands, which she had kept folded in front of her, trembled slightly. Without thinking, she moved closer to him, lowering her voice. I'll be careful. I'll watch what I eat. I promise." Jude's lips curved slightly. "Good. That's all I ask. I just want you to be better. Better." The word hung between them, heavy and unyielding. Angel had spent years chasing it, apologizing for not being it, correcting herself in the quietest ways. She realized in moments like this that she had become adept at preemptive surrender, begging silently, offering concessions, seeking permission to exist in peace. The next morning at Maxwell Holdings, Angel immersed herself in work. The office remained neutral, impartial, a sanctuary compared to her home life. She focused on budgets, spreadsheets, and client communications, but her mind wandered frequently back to the previous night. Jude's insistence, though subtle, had left a residue she couldn't shake. Israel Maxwell passed by her workstation, pausing briefly to glance at a report she had completed. "Your analysis of the vendor delays is thorough," he said calmly. "Good foresight." Angel felt a faint lift in her chest. His words were steady, free of judgment, a recognition she didn't have to earn by apology or surrender. She realized that these small affirmations, almost imperceptible, were beginning to counterbalance the habitual begging that had dominated her life. But the habit was strong. That evening, Jude approached her again. "Angel, I've been thinking about your schedule. You need to make time to exercise. You can't let yourself slip." She felt the old reflex rising, the immediate desire to placate him, to explain, to assure him that she would conform. I will," she whispered almost automatically. "I'll adjust my schedule. I promise." Jude's expression softened. "That's all I ask," he said, settling into his habitual posture of quiet authority. Walking away from him, Angel reflected on the ritual she had repeated countless times. Begging had become habit, a conditioned response she barely noticed anymore. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, subtle, and exhausting. She recognized it now, but recognition alone didn't break the pattern. Later that week, she returned to the office, exhausted from the cumulative weight of subtle corrections and habitual surrender. Israel, as always, noticed her work, not her posture or her weight or the slight slump in her shoulders. "Angel," he said as he passed her desk, "the client projections are clear and accurate. Good job." It was a brief acknowledgement, but it carried a quiet gravity. Unlike Jude, Israel didn't demand adjustment, correction, or apology. His recognition existed independently of her concessions. The contrast was growing sharper in her mind. That evening, Jude called again, discussing dinner plans and hinting at her choices in what she wore. Angel felt the familiar pull, the reflex to preempt conflict by begging forgiveness for minor, imagined failings. But this time she paused. She remembered Israel's calm affirmation from earlier in the week. She remembered the quiet power in being seen without judgment. "I'll adjust," she said softly, but she felt a small resistance in her chest, a quiet awareness that not all words required her surrender. She was beginning, ever so subtly, to measure the necessity of her habitual begging. Walking home later, Angel thought about the invisible chains she had carried for years. Jude's corrections had taught her to anticipate critique, to preemptively placate, to beg for approval. Israel's presence, quiet and steady, reminded her that recognition could exist without surrender, that her worth didn't depend on habitual concessions. By the end of the week, Angel was exhausted but not defeated. She hadn't confronted Jude fully, nor had she broken free of her conditioned patterns. But she had begun to notice the difference between control and acknowledgement, between habit and autonomy. In quiet moments, she realized that begging was no longer an automatic truth. It was a choice, and one day she might choose not to do it at all. And Israel Maxwell, with his calm, steady attention, was showing her that there was a world where she didn't have to shrink, apologize, or beg to exist fully. Angel Andrew had never been accustomed to compliments that felt entirely unburdened. Growing up, Words of praise were always accompanied by expectation or comparison. With Jude Wells, even praise had strings, often hidden, often implied. A compliment from him was rarely just a compliment. It came with correction, measurement, or a subtle reminder of what she could improve. Israel Maxwell, however, operated differently. It was subtle at first. Small acknowledgments of her work, nods in passing, brief mentions of her precision and foresight. But over time, these gestures grew into something more concrete. Compliments offered without expectation, without judgment, and without the quiet pressure to adjust or shrink herself. That Tuesday morning, Angel walked into Maxwell Holdings with a thick folder of reports in her hand. She had stayed late the previous evening, cross-checking client data, reconciling discrepancies, and preparing projections for the department. Exhaustion weighed on her, but she felt a quiet satisfaction in her diligence. Israel Maxwell appeared at her workstation, reviewing the reports she had left on his desk. "Angel," he said softly, "this projection is thorough and well organized. I appreciate the clarity you've brought to it. It makes my work easier." The words were simple, almost offhand. Yet for Angel they landed with a quiet weight. No critique. No hidden expectation. No subtle suggestion for correction. Just acknowledgement and appreciation for effort executed well. She felt a warm, unexpected lightness in her chest, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Later, while walking back from a brief meeting, Israel passed by again. "Your attention to detail on the vendor schedules has prevented potential delays. That's not easy to do consistently. Good work." Angel paused, catching herself smiling without apology. She realized the strange contrast. Jude's compliments were rarely free. They always carried a shadow of inadequacy, a quiet reminder of what she wasn't. Israel's, by contrast, were entirely unencumbered, appreciation offered as it was, without demand or correction. By mid-afternoon, she noticed a subtle shift in herself. When Jude texted to comment on her appearance or habits, "Are you sure you're eating properly?" the old reflex to apologize weakened. She no longer immediately folded inward. She was beginning to internalize that recognition could exist without judgment, and that she could be valued without bending, apologizing, or shrinking herself. A colleague stopped by her desk, asking for clarification on a report she had submitted earlier. Angel explained patiently, noticing the subtle smile on Israel's face as he passed by once more. He didn't speak, didn't comment, just observed. And yet, she felt a reassurance in his steady presence, a quiet validation that her competence, and by extension her worth, was visible. That evening Jude arrived at the apartment, calm but attentive as usual. "You should rest more," he said quietly, "and watch what you eat. I'm just looking out for you." Angel exhaled slowly, a small smile touching her lips. For the first time she didn't feel the need to beg, apologize, or convince him. She simply acknowledged the statement internally, then set it aside. Her sense of self wasn't dependent on immediate compliance anymore. She had begun to experience what Israel had been quietly showing her for weeks. That acknowledgement, appreciation, and respect could exist without strings attached. The contrast was subtle, almost imperceptible in daily interactions, but Angel noticed it growing. Israel's compliments had no conditions. They were steady, real, and consistent. Jude's critiques were habitual, automatic, and often unnecessary, but they no longer dictated her emotional responses in the same way. By the end of the week, Angel sat at her desk reviewing final projections for the department. Israel passed by one last time, glancing at the screen. "Angel, your consistency and accuracy make a real difference here. Thank you for your diligence." Her chest lifted slightly at his words. She realized she no longer immediately minimized her contributions or her presence. For the first time she felt the faint stirrings of authentic self-worth, a subtle internal shift that was quiet but undeniable. Walking home later she reflected on the week. Jude's words still lingered, still carried subtle demands and corrections, but Israel's compliments had begun to anchor her. She no longer folded entirely at criticism. She no longer begged unconsciously for approval. Instead, she had glimpsed a version of herself that could exist fully, confidently, without apology, valued for who she was, not for who someone else wanted her to be. It was slow, imperceptible progress. But it was real. And Angel Andrew, for the first time in years, felt the quiet thrill of being seen, not for correction but for who she was. Angel Andrew had spent years accommodating. Every word, every glance, every suggestion from Jude Wells had been met with preemptive apology or quiet compromise. She had shrunk herself in subtle ways, learned to anticipate correction, and mastered the art of surrender without complaint. But now, the quiet recognition she received from Israel Maxwell had begun to shift her perspective. It started with small things. A minor disagreement over plans with Jude no longer triggered immediate surrender. Instead of nodding and conceding, Angel paused. She considered her own feelings, her own needs, and allowed herself the barest moment of reflection before responding. "I'd rather finish my work first," she said softly one evening, when Jude suggested they go out before she was ready. The words were measured, quiet but firm. "I'll join you afterward." Jude blinked, surprised by the lack of immediate compliance. "Are you sure?" he asked. His tone was calm, but Angel could sense the faint flicker of control he was accustomed to exercising. "Yes," she said. The word was simple, unyielding but free of apology. The relief she felt afterward was small but noticeable. A tiny piece of herself had been reclaimed, and it felt quietly exhilarating. For the first time, she realized that resistance didn't have to be loud or confrontational. It could be quiet, deliberate, and measured, a slow reclaiming of agency. At Maxwell Holdings, Israel Maxwell noticed the subtle shift too. Not in overt ways, but in the careful confidence with which Angel navigated her work. She had always been competent, precise, and thorough, but now there was a quiet steadiness to her demeanor that hadn't been there before. He acknowledged her efforts with a nod, a brief word of thanks, or a subtle compliment on her analysis. "You anticipated the delay correctly," he said one afternoon, glancing at her updated report. "That level of foresight makes a difference." Angel felt her chest lift slightly. His recognition, unlike Jude's, required nothing of her beyond presence and competence. It didn't demand apology, adjustment, or preemptive surrender. Slowly, she was beginning to internalize that value could exist independently of habitual concession. The next challenge came at home. Jude commented again on her weight, his tone calm, almost casual. "You might want to watch your meals. I just worry about you." In the past, Angel would have immediately apologized, explained herself, or offered assurances. This time she paused. She considered the habit of shrinking herself, of seeking approval, of begging for peace. Then she spoke, carefully but with quiet authority. "I'm aware of my choices," she said. "I'll manage." The response from Jude was brief. "All right." No pressure, no insistence, no implicit judgment. And yet, Angel felt a subtle surge of power in that moment, a recognition that she could assert herself without anger, drama, or conflict. Over the following days, Angel practiced this quiet resistance more deliberately. She allowed herself to make small decisions without seeking immediate approval, to speak without preemptive apology, to prioritize her needs before automatic concession. Each small act built on the last, a cumulative shift in the way she navigated her own life. Israel's presence reinforced this transformation. His acknowledgement, steady and impartial, provided a benchmark against which Angel measured herself. She began to see the contrast more clearly. Jude's love demanded shrinking, adjustment, and apology. Israel's recognition existed without precondition, highlighting her worth without requirement for change. By the end of the week, Angel realized that resistance could be subtle yet significant. She wasn't openly confronting Jude. She wasn't declaring independence in dramatic fashion. Instead, she was asserting her autonomy in the quiet, everyday choices, deciding when to speak, how to move, how to exist without apology. Walking home one evening, she reflected on the internal shift. It wasn't sudden nor was it loud. But it was real. The small rebellions, the refusal to apologize unnecessarily, the measured assertions, the recognition of her own value, were slowly dismantling the patterns that had constrained her for years. Angel understood now that resistance was not about confrontation. It was about presence, consistency, and self-awareness. And Israel Maxwell, with his quiet affirmation and steady attention, had shown her that resisting control didn't require dramatic gestures. It could begin with a single, deliberate act of self-respect. For the first time, Angel Andrew felt that resistance didn't have to feel rebellious. It could feel natural, quiet, and real. And that, she realized, was the beginning of a version of herself she hadn't known she could be, fully seen, respected, and gradually, quietly empowered. Angel Andrew had discovered something unexpected. Silence could speak louder than words. Years of bending, apologizing, and shrinking herself had taught her how to fill space with explanations, preemptive concessions, and soft-spoken agreements. But now, with Israel Maxwell's steady acknowledgement quietly affirming her worth, she began to see that silence could carry weight too. It started at home. Jude Wells, accustomed to immediate response and habitual apology, commented again on her appearance one evening. "You should pay more attention to your figure. I just worry about you." Angel's reflexive urge to concede rose instantly. For a fraction of a second, she imagined herself apologizing, explaining, adjusting. Then she noticed something. The familiar pang of frustration had softened. She remembered Israel's simple nods, his calm recognition of her work, the way he had always noticed her without judgment. And so she stayed silent. She didn't apologize. She didn't argue. She simply looked at him calmly and waited. Jude's brow furrowed slightly. "Are you going to respond?" Angel met his gaze, steady and composed. "I hear you," she said quietly. Nothing more. No concession, no argument, no shrinking. The silence stretched longer than either of them expected. Jude eventually exhaled, muttering, "All right," and retreated into his habitual calm. For the first time, Angel felt the power of refusing to give her energy to unnecessary correction. Her silence had spoken volumes, even without raising her voice or demanding attention. At work, the same principle began to assert itself. Maxwell Holdings was a place of neutrality, and Israel's quiet recognition allowed her to see the strength in observation and subtle action. During meetings, she contributed when necessary, corrected errors, and proposed solutions without over-explaining. Her voice was calm but confident, her presence measured yet undeniable. Israel noticed, acknowledging her contributions without fanfare. "Angel," he said one afternoon as he passed by her workstation, glancing at her latest report, "your approach here is thorough. Thank you for preparing it so carefully." The words, simple and direct, reinforced what Angel had learned at home. Value did not always require vocal defense or apology. Her work, her presence, and her choices mattered in themselves. Silence paired with competence had weight. By midweek, Jude began to test her boundaries more subtly. He suggested changes to her schedule, nudged at her personal routines, and commented on minor details of her appearance. Angel listened, observed, and in moments where she would have once argued or apologized, she remained quiet. She made her decisions internally and executed them without justification. Her silence was deliberate, not passive. Each measured choice, each refusal to surrender unnecessarily, became a statement of self-respect. Jude's comments no longer dictated her internal narrative. She allowed only those words that aligned with her reality to influence her emotions. Israel's steady presence reinforced this shift. One morning, while reviewing projections together, he looked at her and said, "The clarity of your report makes a difference. I appreciate your attention to detail. No additional expectation. No critique. Just acknowledgement." The subtle affirmation reminded Angel that she didn't have to shout to be seen or justify her actions to feel valued. By Friday evening, Angel reflected quietly on her progress. She hadn't confronted Jude directly, nor had she ended the habitual pattern entirely. But her silence had begun to speak for her in ways words never could. She recognized the difference between surrender and assertion, between habitual begging and deliberate restraint. Even more importantly, she understood that her own observation and internal awareness mattered. She no longer needed constant external validation to feel her worth. Israel's consistent acknowledgement had planted the seeds of this realization, and her own quiet strength was beginning to grow around them. Walking home, Angel noticed a subtle change in herself. She held her head slightly higher, moved through space more confidently, and observed interactions with a calm, deliberate presence. She wasn't yet free from the shadow of Jude's control, but her choices were becoming intentional. Her silence had become a tool, a statement, and a shield. By the time she reached her apartment, Angel Andrew felt a profound quiet within her. She understood now that resistance didn't always require confrontation, and recognition didn't always need declaration. Silence, measured and purposeful, carried meaning. And Israel Maxwell, with his calm, affirming presence, had shown her that her worth was inherent, visible, undeniable, and steady, even when she said nothing at all. For the first time in her life, Angel realized that being seen didn't always require speaking. Sometimes, it was enough to exist fully, quietly, and intentionally, and that presence, more than words, could reshape the way she viewed herself and her place in the world. Angel Andrew had come a long way. Years of habitual apologies, shrinking, and preemptive surrender had shaped her into someone careful, measured, and quietly obedient. But the slow, steady influence of Israel Maxwell's acknowledgement had shifted her entirely. She no longer sought validation through compromise. She no longer measured herself against Jude Wells' quiet critiques. She had begun to see herself clearly, fully, and unapologetically. It was a Thursday morning when Angel realized the depth of her transformation. Jude called early as he often did, with his habitual tone of quiet concern. "Angel, you should consider adjusting your routine. I just worry about you." For a brief moment she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the reflexive urge to apologize or justify. Then she paused. She remembered her weeks of observing Israel's calm recognition, the affirmations without expectation, the way he had valued her presence, her competence, and her choices without correction. "I appreciate your concern," Angel said softly, deliberately, "but I'm managing my routine on my own." Jude's pause was longer than usual. There was no anger, no attempt to dominate. Just quiet, a subtle acknowledgement that his habitual patterns no longer held automatic control. "All right," he said finally. Angel hung up, exhaling fully. There was no triumph, no dramatic rebellion, just clarity. She understood that her self-respect didn't require confrontation, nor did it demand recognition from someone who could not see her without judgment. Later that morning at Maxwell Holdings, Angel walked through the office with a quiet ease she hadn't felt in years. She moved naturally, spoke without over-explaining, and navigated her tasks with the precision and calm efficiency she had always possessed but had rarely allowed herself to fully own. Israel Maxwell noticed her demeanor immediately. He approached her desk, his eyes briefly meeting hers, and said, "Angel, your presentation this morning was thorough and clear. It reflects your attention and skill. Well done." The words landed differently this time. They weren't a push, a correction, or a subtle test. They were acknowledgement, pure and simple. Angel smiled quietly, not because she needed validation, but because she recognized the value in being seen fully for who she was, without expectation, without judgment, without strings. As the day progressed, Angel handled challenges with calm authority. A miscommunication with a client, a delayed report, a minor internal error, each was addressed with measured professionalism. She no longer anticipated critique unnecessarily. She no longer begged for peace or approval. Her silence, her confidence, and her deliberate choices communicated more than any apology ever had. By evening, Angel and Israel were reviewing the week's financial summaries together. He glanced at her notes, then met her eyes. "Your foresight in preparing for the vendor delays prevented significant setbacks. It's impressive." Angel felt a quiet warmth, but not the relief of validation she had once chased. Instead, it was recognition of her competence and, more importantly, of her agency. Israel's presence had never demanded she shrink, apologize, or adjust. He had seen her steadily, consistently, and without condition. And in seeing her fully, Angel finally understood that being seen did not require saving. Walking home, she reflected on the months of subtle growth. Jude's habitual corrections, which had once dictated her every action, had lost their grip. Israel's affirmations had provided a mirror, showing her what it felt like to exist fully, quietly, and authentically. And through it all, Angel realized something profound. She had always possessed the strength within her. The difference was simply seeing herself through eyes that recognized value without correction. That night, Angel prepared for bed, a quiet contentment settling over her. She didn't need anyone to fix her. She didn't need anyone to correct her. She didn't need apologies she didn't owe or concessions she hadn't agreed to. She simply existed fully as Angel Andrew, capable, competent, and worthy. Israel's presence remained steady, unintrusive but affirming. And Angel, for the first time in years, felt wholly herself, seen, not saved. The lesson was quiet, subtle, and profound. True recognition does not demand surrender. True appreciation allows a person to stand fully in their own strength. As she lay down, Angel smiled softly to herself. Her journey had been long and measured, shaped by years of challenge, observation, and subtle affirmation. But she had arrived. Not because anyone had rescued her, not because of loud declarations, but because she had allowed herself to be seen, acknowledged, and ultimately trusted her own worth. Angel Andrew was free, not in dramatic gestures or confrontation, but in the quiet, enduring knowledge that she was enough. Fully, unapologetically, and undeniably enough.